So thank you for taking the time to join us, everyone. Good morning. We'll hang on a couple of seconds just whilst everyone filtered in from the previous meeting, no doubt, and then we'll get into today's topic, introduce the guests, which is human-centered transformation today. So kind of following on really from the previous two, which has all kind of been focused on responding to and planning for the consumer regulation changes, but also sort of putting people at the sort of heart of that from a transformational perspective across the space as well. So we'll get cracking any second. But yeah, it's one of those, isn't it, where we talk a lot about technology, talk a lot about systems, data, processes when it comes to transformational projects. But if we consider the sort of the purpose of these changes as a whole, and also generally the sort of purpose of the housing sector, we need to sort of put people at the heart of that. And I think sometimes we need to just sort of make sure that that's covered off when we sort of talk about the ambitions and the goals for it. So that's what we'll be covering today. And yeah, we'll get into introducing our guest shortly as well, who I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, Julia. But yeah, we're just past 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. Those of you who are new to us, we'll go through some short introductions shortly into myself, into Prodo and guest speakers today as well. We do record these, so we do tend to have the sort of the microphones muted, but please do feel free to use the chat for any sort of questions you might want to ask Julia or any of us from Prodo as well. We will have some time towards the end for to sort of address some of those queries as well, so feel free to do that. I encourage you to do so. And then yeah, have a little look out in the chat for any sort of helpful links and things that we'll be putting in there as well. So if you want to sort of follow up on the conversation with any of us, feel free to do so. But yeah, we'll get into today's topic. So I suppose just to begin with, my name's Jacob. I'm head of sales here at Prodo. Been working with the organisation for 6 years now, and I think our role as a sort of digital transformation specialist in the sector has evolved and changed throughout the sort of the time of 20 plus years working with HAs across the country. We're very much focused these days on helping organisations build trust with customers, unlock capacity internally, and ultimately those two things feeding into transforming customer experience as well. And our offering across the board is quite varied, from digital consultancy services through to web design, web development, and also a suite of software products that we have as well around self-service and sort of engaging tenants, lots of systems integrations, those sorts of things. So that's us, that's Prodo. We'll move into a very brief sort of introduction in terms of background of today's topic, and then we'll get into the main part of it. So yeah, onto today's topic then, really, which is human-centered transformation. After sort of having some preparation discussions and conversations in the past with Julia and sort of discussing the journey that Raven Housing Trust have been on. But yeah, as I say at the beginning, I think when we discuss transformation as a whole, it's really easy to sort of keep that sort of central focus, really, isn't it, around auditing the systems, looking into processes specifically, finding efficiencies internally, maybe sort of cleansing data as part of that as well. But what absolutely can't be forgotten when you're sort of considering the purpose of change, and also, as we were saying earlier, the sort of the purpose of the housing sector itself across the board, it's helping people and it's improving lives. So human-centered transformation, sort of having that focus on those people, it will place individuals and communities at the heart of those decisions and decision-making as a whole, recognising challenges, specific needs across the board as well, aspirations. And it's really about creating solutions that not only leverage the power of technology, but also sort of encourage and foster that inclusivity, accessibility, empowering customers and sort of colleagues alike as well. And that's really well aligned to our purpose as a digital consultant and software provider in the space as well at Prodo. You'll hear, sort of countless case studies across the board and stats around, okay, we've driven channel shift up, we've reduced call volumes, we've saved on arrears here, and those things are all obviously really important measurables to sort of focus on when looking to sort of measure success. But I think for us, and more so these days, and you can sort of see it in the consumer regulation changes and TSMs, etc., it's almost that sort of so what piece, really. If it is that the time's been saved and capacity's been created, sort of where's that been put forward, and what's that meant for engagement? What's that meant for customer satisfaction? What about digitally excluded people? And I think it's our collective responsibility as partners in the space, but also everyone sort of across the board to sort of ensure that transformation is serving people in the best way it could be. So I suppose with that said, with me today is our CEO, Rob Quayle, who's got a background of driving really customer-centric change across product and sort of product design as well across multiple sectors. And Julia Mixter, who you probably will all be familiar with, who has essentially spearheaded transformational change across Raven Housing Trust as well, which we're really looking forward to hearing more about. So I thought now would be a good time to introduce yourself, Rob, and then we can sort of hand over to Julia as well. If that's all right.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jake. Lovely to meet you all. As Jake said, I've been at Prodo for about 9 months, I think now. But my background is digital transformation and software development across a whole variety of sectors. And this sort of topic's really close to my heart because transformations always start with people and end with people. And if you don't put the people at the heart of it, then they're more likely than not to fail. So actually really putting the person in the centre of that process is really key.
Thanks, Rob.
Julia.
Morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me here today. And I was hugely excited by Prodo, to be asked by Prodo to have this conversation about what we deliberately called human-centered transformation. I talk a lot about sort of the technology and the process and the data, but actually an opportunity to talk about the people at the centre of transformation is really very critical for me. So yeah, really here today to start a conversation about human-centered transformation. And in a perfect world, this might be less about sort of getting employees and customers on the journey that you as a housing association want to take, and more about putting their needs at the centre of transformation, so that ultimately we're making their lives and experience of social housing a better one. But we don't live in a perfect world. So whilst it's a really noble aim, it isn't always easy or realistic. By the way, I should say from the outset that whilst I will talk about some of the things that Raven has done, some of these opinions are my own. So I'll just add that little disclaimer at the beginning. Because if you ask people what they want from your services, they may well say, I want someone to talk to who's actually going to spend some time listening to me. Where what you want to do is to actually digitize your services and make them more efficient. So then I think it's really important to be upfront and to say, you know, in the context of our need to minimize the cost of transactional process and do them online so we can invest more in your home, which services is it really important that we keep personal and human? And I honestly believe that whilst you're going to hear me talk a lot about putting human needs at the centre of transformation, at the same time, housing associations cannot realistically provide services in every way that every person wants them to with limited funds. The sort of hotels and banks that offer true individualisation do so at an incredibly high cost. And housing associations simply don't have those funds. So to invest in personalisation in some areas, I think really does require efficiency in others. So throughout this presentation, I am going to try and walk a tightrope of what might be ideal and what is actually realistic in the discussion. And I apologise in advance if I contradict myself through some of this as we go through. I think it shows some of the complexity of what we're trying to do in social housing. So I just want to step back for a second and reflect on something that's probably bothered me since I've started out in social housing about 6 years ago. The history of social housing has discussed the damage that it can do when we attach negative perceptions to and judgments around people living in social housing. And I think whilst there is a really good reason to ensure fair and equal access to services for all residents, there is perhaps some risk attached to some of the aims around the new consumer standards. And at the worst end, clumsy attempts to group customers by protected characteristics and design services for groups could give a slightly uncomfortable sense of othering. You might have customer journey maps that branch off to specific services for children with something like ADHD or other mental health concerns or other needs. It could lead to very, very complex service design and high costs that potentially may have little real impact. So whilst the intention is positive, the execution with limited budgets and teams and expertise may not actually deliver what is needed. And I think there's a risk in the midst of all this sort of frantic service redesign, we may forget that we're all collectively human. And at one time or other, we may all become more or less vulnerable. And the Ombudsman themselves, their own definition describes this as quite dynamic. A highly paid manager could quite easily experience family breakdown and alcoholism and be homeless within weeks. So vulnerability often links to a complex set of circumstances, often stemming from childhood and not always apparent on the surface. So trying to design services that can dynamically respond to changing circumstances could be complex, challenging, and expensive. On the other hand, if you like a healthy debate, I think there is absolute evidence that putting the human at the centre could actually save money. So humans have some very basic needs, such as the need for food, water, air, shelter, and then higher order needs. And remembering people as humans and not just customers means we may be more likely to take the time to hear their stories and their personal experiences to really enrich our understanding. And there's a website, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because I will get it wrong on this slide, but if you want to read a little more around sense making, which I think is a really interesting concept. And there's a reason you may have noticed that Maslow's hierarchy triangle is upside down. So I went to a DIN conference in November, and the excellent Math Potts was there, and he shared his view on homelessness from talking to a lot of people who had become homeless. And one of the biggest reasons was relationship breakdown, and that people rarely hang on to food and shelter without self-worth and positive relationships. And I think that's a hugely important concept to reflect on and understand in the context of rising incidence of mental health conditions, including anxiety and depression and depleted social services. Because the role of housing associations in helping to achieve positive outcomes where mental and physical and financial and social health are intrinsically linked has actually never been more important. Because being listened to and understood can not only help limit the escalation of mental health problems, but actually can act as a mitigating factor in the first place. So listening to the human beings in your homes, you may find that the homes and services that you deliver genuinely can lead to life-changing outcomes. And I think there was a great case of that in Great Yarmouth, and this was highlighted by Ian Wright on LinkedIn. By ending choice-based lettings and adopting a system based on conversations with people about their housing problems, the council managed to cut their waiting list from 6,000 in 2010 to 309 by 2015. And that is a phenomenal change. And you can only begin to think about the positive impact that had on the mental well-being of those people. And I commented that it reminded me of a coach who said that humans have 3 basic emotional needs: to be listened to, cared for, and understood. And I think it showed that Great Yarmouth had taken the time to be human. So how can we be human when we start to think about digital transformation? If you move on to the next slide, please.
Sure.
So, we don't have a huge amount of time today, so I'm only going to give a sample of the ways that we tried to be human and customer first in our transformation in Raven. So right at the beginning, we started with a big piece of customer research that we called the voice of the customer. And before even putting pen to paper on our transformation strategy, we did this research to find out what our customers really wanted from us, to understand what needed to change, and more importantly, why. And I think any housing association considering transformation would or should do the same. This should feed into the priorities. And I think what was really important for me about this research, it wasn't about the digital services people wanted. If you look at what was on this slide, it was some really human concepts. What does your home mean to you? How can we improve the trust in our relationship? What are your future life aspirations, and how can Raven be a part of those? Next slide, please. And from this research, whilst we saw a lot of customers were satisfied, we were able to have much more human and detailed conversations with the 10% who felt their needs weren't being met. And from those conversations, you get rich insights such as the answer to an unsuitable sized home for customers isn't always moving. That's a big disruption. Sometimes they just want us to sort out the storage. The importance of repairs becomes really emotionally heightened if there are very young children in the home. And it's important to understand not that just that someone is just living with a disability, but the impact of that disability on how they lead their life and how they go about their day-to-day business. These human conversations led to much greater insight about how we needed to transform. And we put it into our strategy, and we put the customer needs at the heart of our service design, and we put customer first into our culture statement. So there was a constant reminder of this kind of Amazon type obsession of being customer obsessed and then working backwards and inwards from there. Next slide, please. And we repeated this detailed research more recently, particularly with a view to understanding our customers' lived experiences in our homes. And again, I found this hugely insightful. It introduced 2 things for me. One, while some people may feel that questions about what led to customers being in Raven may feel intrusive, and we should respect that, for other people, they really wanted us to know so that we could offer them greater support from the outset. And it also introduced the so what factor into our thinking. So it's no good just asking people, Do you have a protected characteristic? Do you have a disability? What you need to understand is what this means for them and how they live their life, the true human element. And some of our researchers were surprised just how hard it was to get consistent contact with some of our customers, even to pay them for their time. But those working in your customer service teams probably wouldn't be so surprised. So it's so important to connect your repairs service redesign around your no access procedure with all the wasted money of repeated visits, with information from a customer telling you that they struggle to fulfill appointment commitments. Because if you don't, you'll be wasting money and also not meeting the needs of the human in the home. So for me, it really seems like a win-win. Understand, meet the human need, and potentially save money in doing so. Moving on. At a more granular level, we did some great work with Clive Grenier. For everything I've said about customer service design and maps, we did do a lot of those things. Clive Grenier is from the Royal Academy on service design, and it really again showed the importance of getting alongside and involving the human in the service design to avoid making assumptions. And he uses a brilliant example of being in an airport and seeing a huge number of people using the toilets. And without customer research, you could easily make the assumption that you just need more toilets. But insight from speaking to customers showed that people actually went in there because it was quieter and they could hear the tannoys. So what you actually needed to address in service design was the location and volume of the tannoys. And we also partnered with the excellent Tracy Allen, who helped us to achieve really good quality service design in quite short sprints. And this slide actually shows how in just 4 days, you can not only do service design, but include customer research, because sometimes it can feel like service design is this kind of huge beast that you need to get right. And honestly, the process was very good. And if you look at the vision on the next slide, this really hasn't changed a great deal throughout our transformation. So our vision was to put the customer in control of our service design, whether that was a repairs or a compliance visit. And if you move to the next slide, that led to concepts, really not life-changing concepts, are they? But, being able to book when it suits you, to have an appointment slot when you need it, to be able to get online and get a response and confirmation outside of the customer contact hours and things like that. But having a blueprint like this says, this is how we want to be able to respond to what our customers have told us. And then you can assess it against that reasonableness tightrope of what it's feasible and affordable to deliver, and when you can flex to respond to individual needs. And I just want to move on to the final example of putting the human customer at the centre. And this was about the build of our websites with an organisation called Connect, where we used card sorts. And this reflects on the notion that human beings follow what are called desire lines. And in the book, The Universal Principles of Design, this means that it talks about use or wear that indicates preferred methods of interaction with an object or an environment. And we did this during the pandemic, so we could do it online with our customers. And online cards represented the website buttons, and customers could move them around where they expected them to be. And we could go with the majority preference. So again, you're not making the human work hard to find the things they want. You're putting it straight into their desire line. That's putting the human at the center. And we did a lot of other things, making sure that images reflected our users, making sure there's really good accessibility, making sure language reflected every type of tenancy type, all of it about trying to make the human feel included. So just moving on to my final couple of slides. What about staff? Because in transformation, staff are humans too. And I think it's really unlikely that if you asked our staff what they wanted, they would say ADCAR. There's a good chance they may not have even heard of it. And along the lines of sort of no Sherlock, the answer to finding out what people really want is by listening to them. And so we did a big piece of work at the beginning of transformation, talking to our colleagues in workshops, listening to and trying to understand what they wanted to be different, what their goals and aspirations were, what wasn't working for them, in order to design our target operating model. But it's important, and I think Jacob said, I'm quite open with sharing mistakes. At this point, we made our biggest mistake in our desire to get communication right and get people excited and engaged in this program called Better Connected. We overpromised. We gave people the impression that their life was going to be better and happier and shinier in every way post-transformation. And probably the most overblown statement would be that it would be easier. And I think, don't get me wrong, some things are infinitely better. Our staff can access systems anywhere, anytime, depending on network connectivity. They have access to all sorts of transparent information, but it doesn't necessarily mean things are easier. Sometimes there are more fields to complete, more information to fill in, because this gives better data, a more complete picture of the customer, but it doesn't make it easier for the staff member. And why is that so important? Why does that matter? Because in the field of human psychology, if you make promises that you break, it affects trust. And trust is one of the most fundamentally important concepts in the employment relationship. So if you're delivering human-centered transformation, try and keep that trust at the heart and try not to overpromise as you go through. And whilst just touching on ADKAR, I think it's a really helpful model for planning change. I think we possibly missed a little bit of the human here as well. One of our project managers reflected in the team he was supporting that whilst the ADKAR scores of team members were broadly similar, the team behaviours were quite different from those who are actively disengaged to highly positive and engaged. And we think our use of ADKAR perhaps focused too much on the assessment of the change itself, rather than how colleagues were dealing with change as human beings. And just moving on to the penultimate slide. I think another part of being human is recognizing that being a change leader is phenomenally difficult. And there will be times that you have your own crises and see some problems as completely intractable. I 100% did. And I was actually having coaching and I wanted to understand why do some people seem so negative and so reluctant to accept the improvement we're trying to make, despite all we're trying to do? And I think I was forgetting the human, and I was seeing transformation almost as like battle lines between the good people who wanted to move forward and the people on the other side who wanted to stay there. And I just didn't know how to address that. And my coach introduced me to Julia Bridges. And this model really resonated with me. I'm not an expert, but the way she described it was that resistance and commitment are close together. Both of them have energy. In undertaking change, you need to understand resistance energy and stay curious to it. If you take a common area like assets or health and safety, there is a reason that people resist moving on from their spreadsheets, or from Bob, the head of assets, who has all the information that you need and who provides that reassurance and certainty. The William Bridges model describes loss and new beginnings. In any change, there are endings and there are new beginnings. And in the change, you're going to lose something. It might be your spreadsheet or your Bob. And you have to face new beginnings, which might be your new system. And people will be worried about whether they're going to be competent in the new system. They care, so they want the comfort blanket of the spreadsheet they've used for 20 years. And in the middle of change, it feels like stepping off a pavement, stepping into traffic with cars coming at you from all sides before you get safely to the other side. So in planning change, spend time thinking about who might be losing something, what they fear they're losing, and how we can help them adjust to the new world. People don't want to lose their turf, their power, their staff, whatever it is. If you push someone too quickly, they may well push back. And they might look like they're going along with the change, but agreeing and committing are two really different things, because functional words can come with really dysfunctional behaviour. People going back to old systems or just doing workarounds. So it's really important to spend time facing into and having conversations about the things being lost to help people cross that road safely and stay on the other side and not step back. So finally, I've created a sort of, I've totally forgotten the acronym, whatever it is, around the word human. You don't have to be a psychologist to design and deliver good change, but you do have to have a genuine desire to understand people, understand what people really want below the surface level, to take time to focus on those really deep and human needs, particularly when we work in a sector that has such a profound impact on people's lives. I think delivering trusted services, caring about the people who deliver those services, and putting humans right at the centre of that change is probably the very least that we all and our customers and staff deserve. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Julia. That was excellent. Kind of as expected, I suppose, from the throughout that, and the sort of the thread that you put all the way through it. It's quite an inspiring reminder, really, of kind of what we're doing here in terms of the purpose of not only the space but the sort of transformational change that we all talk a lot about. Because I think, going back to the start, it is easy to focus on certain other elements, but yeah, I think it has to be focused around how this change impacts people's lives, whether that be customers at the forefront or also sort of internal colleagues as well. I know you've got some questions, Rob, but just one that sprung to my head as you were talking, then Julia. And yeah, it is great that you're really open to talk about sort of challenges and things along the journey with Raven and the sort of the process you've been through. But one you mentioned around where you felt like potentially it was an error to sort of overpromise, but then you sort of followed that with, there always is that sort of resistance, isn't there, to change, because people are quite comfortable and know that certain incumbent processes work for them. And therefore, it kind of feels right at that point, doesn't it, to talk about things like making things easier or making things quicker or better. So on that basis of having that resistance, but also in hindsight, possibly overpromising with some of the language there, is there ways that you would have maybe addressed that differently? Because it feels like a difficult sort of balance, that, to me, from what you said.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely don't have a perfect answer to that one, because you really do, at the beginning of change, if anyone said to you, you're still going to be there 4 years down the line, limping across the line with system change, you might go, blimey, I'm never going to even get started in the first place. And you want people to be excited and enthusiastic, but I genuinely believe it's getting a healthy balance between clear aspirations and goals and saying, we will certainly work as hard as we possibly can to meet those expectations, but not absolutely promising that transformation is going to deliver everything. And it's very easy, as you said, to get caught up in the shiny sales pitch. If you asked me 5 years ago, I would be like, oh my God, Dynamics is going to be the answer to absolutely everything. And we're going to go from these awful legacy systems that are really difficult to change and takes, months of consultant spend to do anything. And we're going to have this system that we can change on a dime and make work perfectly for everyone. And of course, that's not reality, but it's quite easy to be sold that pitch when you're at the early stages of transformation. So yeah, just keeping a healthy skepticism, I think, is probably the best advice I've got.
The thing with that, though, is in one sense the pitch is right, isn't it? But actually, you're moving effort or data entry, essentially, because data entry always drives the process, but you're moving that further up the business process, aren't you? So typically the people in the call center or salespeople or the doers who are actually on the front line, typically trying to solve a problem, are then expected to do more because that insight or that extra data point drive better value for the business as a whole, but has typically been entered by somebody in finance because that's the end of the process and they had to enter that to get the invoice out the door or whatever the back end is. And getting that across to the people in the call center is always the challenge, because they don't necessarily care about the bigger picture. They're just focused on, they need to do their job, and their job is now harder than it was before you did this. And really that sort of hearts and minds is it's always the challenging part, I always find.
Yes, I think you could flip that and say, actually, in the contact center, again, you probably are asking them to do more, but if you get your transformation right, the transparent, because a lot of it, the frustration is often when they're trying to chase the answer to something that they're not in control of being able to answer, or they can't get access to information, or the information that's been put in is incorrect information. And I think if you can move to the point, which Raven fortunately now has, of having one system from customer contact all the way through sort of repairs, compliance, all the way into sort of invoicing and finance, that ability to just see transparently across the whole customer journey can actually allow your staff to feel much more in control and much more able to, we all want to feel useful. We, back to that sense of purpose, we want to feel useful to our customers and to be able to answer their question as best as you can. And I think that's what transformation can deliver in terms of positive outcome.
Absolutely.
When it comes to, because I know when we discussed this recently, we kind of talk about these three pieces, don't we, of people, technology, data. When it comes to having, the right sort of goals in mind to sort of benefit the people from a transformational change perspective, but also other pressures of organizational ambitions and organizational based change and requirements, how would you say that's best sort of aligned? I know both of you sort of discussed this with one another recently on that sort of alignment of organizational and people requirements for sort of change as well.
I'm happy to go first unless you want to, Rob.
That's fine, go for it.
One thing I never wanted to have was a transformation strategy as such. I mean, we did end up with one to try and just make it tidy, but the transformation strategy very deliberately is simply there to deliver the business outcomes. If you have a transformation strategy sitting off to the side, that's no good. If you have financial outcomes that are not embedded in your budget and business plan, that's pointless, because no one will really care, because they're still looking at the budget and business plan. So embedding your transformation as just a fundamental way of how you're going to change how you do business, and recognizing that the point of transformation is to optimize the delivery of strategic outcomes, is probably the most important thing you can do. Because the second you stop doing that, you start to deliver projects that are pointless, and you're just doing it because you've said you're going to do this release at this date and in this time. What you've got to constantly do is use that connection to strategic outcome to sense check and go, right, is this still going to deliver this, or have things moved on and changed, and actually do we now need to take a decision to pause? And we actually ourselves took that decision to pause the very final release of our program, because actually we didn't necessarily think it was going to be the quickest and best way to get to the strategic outcomes we wanted to achieve. So truly embedding transformation into the way you do business is absolutely essential.
I mean, speaking from a sort of Prodo perspective, what we find is that organizations are struggling to get to that strategic outcome because they're struggling with how to sort of bring the systems together and understand the data. And what we're really trying to help the sector do is sort of step back and look at it more from the person, which is the whole point of this conversation, isn't it? Rather than just the asset, because actually managing the person through that process, right the way through from sort of finding their first home, and that might be a B&B, and facilitating them going into that house, or helping them apply for benefits, helping them apply for a bank account through that sort of workflow. That's where we're going to start to see those bigger strategic outcomes, rather than focusing on how do we manage the repair in this property because it's affecting this tenant. It's taking that holistic view, which is what we probably need to do as a sector to start to realise the bigger outcomes. Otherwise, we're still on that same treadmill.
Yeah, we had a really good conversation before, didn't we, about this, Rob?
Yeah.
And it gets right to the heart of what are housing associations here to do. And I'm certainly not standing here as an expert, but just a really interesting provocation, because you're going to have some boards and housing associations who see themselves, the importance of their role as being fantastic house developers and people who are looking after an asset and making it as good a, I'm going to call it asset, but home as it possibly can be, and it is net zero carbon, and it's efficient, and it's cheap or free to run, and all of those things. That's the number one and most important thing. You'll have others where preventing homelessness is the most important thing, and others that see the social care side of delivery as the most important thing. So it's, to what extent can we see ourselves as a sector with a aim? And we talked about what's the hook, because I think we were talking about supermarkets, and they wanted to halve the sustainability impact of a basket of shopping, and you say actually that's a really noble aim that the whole sector can gather around and try and deliver. And sometimes it's quite hard to work out what the noble aim of housing is to do for the customers living in our homes, and I think that's part of the challenge we have when we're doing transformation. It's like, what is it to achieve? Is it to support the lives of people living in our homes, or is it to be better house builders, or is it any one of those things, depending on your aspirations as a particular HA?
It is absolutely the HA's aspirations and where they want to achieve, but then people's expectations, particularly off the back of COVID, are expecting the land to do more and more. So then it essentially, in terms of transformation, we then have to adapt to actually delivering what their expectations are, or managing their expectations, so they have to go over here to get that resolution.
And is it have a social housing landlord here with one set of goals and aims, and another one here, and their sort of postcode right next to each other, but actually with two widely different sort of approaches to support? But I mean, these are big sector questions. I'm sure others far more knowledgeable have debated, but that is all about putting the human at the centre, isn't it, of what we're trying to do?
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. You mentioned before, Julia, about on the sort of transformation programs, and maybe not necessarily having that transformational strategy, but ended up sort of having one to sort of keep things on track and keep things tidy and sort of shareable, I suppose. But yeah, I agree that these things have to be completely agile, because things do change, certainly if it's a 3, 5, 8 year program. So on that on that basis then, were there things in particular on your experiences at Raven whereby the original sort of aim and ambition included X requirements in certain areas, but as you sort of move through, there was actually some specific change you sort of had to move through to ensure that those strategic objectives with putting the people at the centre were kind of met?
100%. We had scope creep without question. Again, I think we had sort of expectations of the system that, so some things we were disappointed by not having, and then other things we just wanted more and more. And as soon as we could find out what could be done, we then, added to it. When we started out, we hadn't said in our scope we want a portal for our contractors, for example, but we ended up with a contractor portal because they are another part of how we deliver what we do. We ended up with a new website because we wanted to improve how our customers could access information. I think data became increasingly important. I think our chief executive had a very clear view on data right from the outset, but I think we had a dawning realization of just how important it was to get the whole data piece right and have a very clear sort of data architecture and strategy throughout. And I think getting really good at functional requirements is something that I know a lot of HAs potentially struggle with. And I think just saying, we want it to deliver a business plan, and your supplier goes, yes, it can do a business plan. And then the devil's in the detail when you're sitting in workshops and going, well, what do you mean by business plan? It's completely different from what we mean by business plan. And that's where you can get unstuck between people's expectations. And you have to be quite robust and blunt. You have to keep pushing at things and keep digging and getting under the skin of what everyone's meaning, and not allow, because people by nature want to kind of be agreeable and nice, and you'll sit in meetings and you'll kind of go, okay, yeah, we think it's okay, but actually it's not, and you have to keep niggling away at it until you've got a really, really aligned understanding, because otherwise you do get this constant mismatch of expectation in the program, I think.
And you mentioned when you were talking earlier about introducing the service design process, where you started the sprint with that and the sort of 4-day thing. Did you find that then added a lot of value in streamlining that to stop some of those conversations?
Yeah, we did this chicken and egg thing right at the beginning when we said we want our staff, our managers, to think about the service as they want it to be, not as it is. And then they said, yeah, but until we know what the technology can do, it's really hard to imagine that. So we went in the end with, we'll work it out as we go through. And looking back, I think doing service design, knowing the services you deliver, knowing, how you want those services to change, and having a blueprint for those services, I would always start at that point, because it will, particularly if you're on a time and materials contract, it will stop you wasting a huge amount of money as well. So yeah, I would absolutely start there.
I mean, I've seen a lot of transformations where people haven't done that service design at the start, and as you say, then you're on a T&M contract and you're just spending more and more money.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, typically you can do them in sort of less than 5 days, as you say, so they're not big things, but they're perceived to be quite boring, and they need a little bit of effort and thought and planning and consideration, that when actually people just want to get stuck in and start doing it, but then you never get the outcome you want.
I think that's spot on. I think, if you make it a big beast, then people go, yeah, but we've signed the contract, we want to get on with it. Actually, if you say, no, you can do it in other ways, and it can be great fun. If you're looking at something like Crazy Eights, is, you write 8 ideas in 8 minutes and then you share this, you can have a bit of fun with it, because, transformation can be a bit relentless. And actually, this is your moment to pause and have a bit of fun with creativity. And again, if you're not doing the service design, then how are you knowing what your customers are wanting? You have to be testing and validating these ideas with the customers, which isn't easy. We tried various different ways of engaging with customers, and some were definitely more successful than others were.
We spoke with Saffron at the Outsmart Data Summit back in November, and they did a whole piece of work where the customers really bought into that process because they helped shape it. And then actually, when it wasn't right, I think it was the repairs when we were talking about at the time, but it wasn't working the way that everybody expected, then because they'd helped shape it, then they actually owned it as well, and owned that issue and how to get it right. So it's absolutely right to get customers on that journey. It makes a real difference.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a small win, but it felt like a really important one when someone posted on social media about how to do something, and immediately a customer jumped in and said, this is how you can do it on the portal. And that's when you really feel like you've achieved something, because your customers are advising, you know, each other on how to do something easily, and they're saying it is easy to use. That feels really good when you've achieved that.
No, it is a really good outcome.
On that involvement piece that you mentioned, some tactics work better than others. I think that's something we hear quite a lot with the programs we kind of support or sort of drive, in terms of, we know we need to involve customers. We know it should be a sort of a cross section of the different segmentations of customer types that we have. But you're always going to have those people, aren't you, where they do just want to sort of live in a home and they just want to be sort of left alone. You're going to have people that do want to be very much involved, and maybe some of those different customer types will engage better than others. So were there particular sort of routes to that you did find in terms of specifics work well versus those that maybe in hindsight didn't on your journey?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's others probably much better qualified. I think Grand Union did a great presentation on this, but just from our experience, you know, again, it's remembering people are humans, and that if you try and get people to gather in person to do anything, whether it's in social housing or volunteering for local drama groups, the people who turn up will be of a certain demographic. You know, often they're people who don't have to be working, don't have to be traveling, you know, long hours either side, maybe don't have young children. So you have to offer, you know, multiple different options for how you want people to engage. We did try a kind of a panel who would be with us throughout transformation, and we tried a lot of, you know, what seemed like good practice at the time of you know, being very engaging and looking at, you know, providing an iPad so that people could be in regular contact. And honestly, for the amount of investment of time, it was so hard to maintain a group of people who were able and willing to commit through the program. So actually what we found was those digital engagements were far more effective, where we widened it out to sort of say, look, whoever wants to be involved in this, and I think the Connect card sort was a great example. We had a really, really good response rate to that, where you just make it as easy as possible, quite fun, quite engaging, and I think that really opens the doors for a lot more engagement in the process. It's not going to be for everyone, because obviously those people who you're trying to bring into a digital environment who aren't currently digital, you will still have to find ways to engage differently. But yeah, it's opening the funnel as wide as you can, I think.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, great. I don't think there's been any questions come through Teams just yet. But I know we've covered off a few that we had before the session just there. I know we're sort of reaching time at the moment as well. So any further queries from yourself, Rob, on this at all?
No, I mean, as we did in the prep call, Julia and I could talk about this for ages. But yeah. No, I think it goes back to what I said at the start. It does start and end with people, and really bringing the people into that process at whatever point, whether that be design or customers. That's ultimately what will be the most successful outcome. Yeah,
brilliant. Okay. Well, great stuff. Well, really enjoyed that. So thank you very much for your time and effort, Julia, and also obviously yourself as well, Rob, sort of collaborating on the Q&A side of things there. It was really great to hear, and just sort of, I suppose, reframe the term transformation to some extent as well, in terms of really focusing it on the people and sort of the purpose of it and what the potential benefits are for those individuals and communities, rather than, you know, just focusing on those sort of cold, hard stats that we quite often end up looking into. So thank you very much for that. It was excellent. We have sort of reached time now, so I suppose it'd be a good time to close off now and talk quickly about the next session, which will be 25th of April. And I know this one today was very much kind of taking a step back and looking at transformation kind of as a whole, and particularly Julia's sort of insight from Raven's journey and very much focusing on the people. Next month we'll be talking specifically about one part of that, which is a change that we've seen sort of drive through the sector probably the last 12 to 18 months or so, around specifically CRM platforms in particular. Julie kind of alluded to Dynamics being one part of the sort of the Ravens journey as well. So we'll be joined by our sister company, who are a CRM implementer, and sort of working through CRM implementations for one of the biggest housing associations in the country at the moment as well. So we'll be focusing specifically on CRM implementations and how we sort of bring people on that journey and focus on the customer and colleagues and that sort of specific outcome as well. So we will follow up with information on that shortly, with some promos and things via email and socials that you sort of typically expect. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. Big thank you to Julia, big thank you to Rob.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll see you for the next one next month. Thank you very much.
Happy Easter. Enjoy chocolate.
Easter.
See you.
Will do. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks.